A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So tausend Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been generously sponsored in memory of Rabbi Yehuda ben Reb Chaim Nosson Zechrona Levracha, born in Sighet and after the war settled in Borough Park and davened in the Sighet Shul led by the Bayrach Moshe Zatzal, followed by his son Reb Zalman Leib Shlita, the current Satmar Rebbe. And this episode, and really a mini-series, which will be about the history of the Jewish community in the town of Sighet. And it's a long in the making, and there was the recent yahrzeit of the Satmar Rav this past week, and it's the town of his birth, and I just want to talk about its history and personalities of this town of Sighet. And I've always wanted to delve into the story of Sighet, and I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to do so. It is, on one hand, the birthplace of the Satmar Rav, and of course the whole Teitelbaum dynasty, and it's so associated with that name, it's almost synonymous. The Satmar Rav, the Teitelbaums, the Kuntres Hasfeikos, the Yativ Lev, and even earlier, and on one hand that they're associated with Sighet, and on the other hand, a person like Eli Wiesel, believe it or not, also grew up there. So one of the most famous Holocaust survivors of all time, and definitely after the war, not religious anymore, though he grew up in a very Hasidic home before the war in Sighet. So I was always fascinated by that. Of course, they're very different ages. The Satmar Rav and Eli Wiesel are about 40 years apart, but they both grew up in the same town. So how did the same town produce people who were so different? Now, I've always been fascinated by it. On one hand, it's at the end of the Jewish world. It's not supposed to be significant. It's a relatively new community. It doesn't have a long history. It was small, a very small community until really recently, until the mid to late 1800s, at the end of the Jewish world, tucked away in the Maramaros region, away from all the centers of Jewish life. In theory, no one should have ever heard of this place. And yet, on the other hand, Sighet is very, very prominent. It rose in size and prominence. It was the district capital of the Maramaros district in Transylvania. And so many famous personalities either grew up there or lived there or served there in some capacity. So it achieved this renown in as one of the more important Jewish communities, towns pre-war, and has a history and a legacy until today. If nothing else, Satmar today, of course, traces directly there in two obvious ways. The Satmar Rav grew up there, which I just mentioned. He was born there, got married there, and the Satmar Rav, who unfortunately had no living descendants. Tragically, his daughters predeceased him. So when he passed away in 1979, the succession went to his nephew, Reb Moshe Teitelbaum, the Bayrach Moshe, who was, of course, Sighet. He was the son of the Sighet Rav, and he had the Sighet Shtibel in Borough Park. So I think it would be a very interesting journey to explore the story and personalities of this very special and historic town of Sighet. Today it's in Romania, and not many trips go to Romania. I want to give another push for trips to go to Romania. There's lots to see there. It's a very large and rich in Jewish history. one can either stick to the north, where Satmar and Sighet are, and go to Hungary as well, and in better times, hopefully when there's no more war anymore, then we can cross the border into Ukraine from there, and go to Chust, or Chist, as they say, and Munkach is right across the border in Ukraine also, that whole region, or further south, there's loads of Jewish history in the rest of Romania as well, so Romania definitely should be on more trips. It reminds me of a story from one of my trips when we were in Poland. We had just finished the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, and we were about 20 different Rebbes there. We were by the Radomska Rebbe, the Novominsker Rebbe, and the Radzina Rebbe, and the Slonimer Rebbe, and the Mozhitz Rebbe, and the Amshinover Rebbe, and all these big, huge Polish Rebbes. We're leaving the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. We're on our way out of Warsaw. We're going to go to Ger, to go to the Chidush Rebbe, the Sfas Emes, and then we're going to head to Lublin. We were planning on being by the Chayz of Lublin, and we were going to end the day in Lezhensk by the Rebbe of Meilich, the Naim Elimelech. And as we're walking out of the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery to do all that, I was asked by a participant on the trip, tell me something, do you do Hasidic-themed trips as well? So I said to him, well, what do you call this trip? So he said, no, I mean real Hasidus. Like Sighet and Satmar. So, we have to do that more. We have to get to Romania and do the real Hasidus of Sighet and Satmar more than, I guess, the not as real places such as the Rebbe of Meilich and Lezhensk. Either way, so it's in Romania today, but it gets confusing because sometimes it was in Hungary. It's right near the Hungary border. It's right near Ukraine. It's right north of Romania. It's an area that has been known throughout history as Transylvania, and it's in between Romania and Hungary and bordering Ukraine. It's in the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a long time, and there's all these changing borders. Sometimes that general region is sometimes called the Carpato-Rus, Carpathian Rus. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And that's the various different names. So you might hear, it's the Maramaros district. That's where Sighet is. It was in Hungary. It was in Romania. It's Transylvania. It's near Ukraine. It was in Ukraine. It's in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The town itself, believe it or not, never moved. It's just that the borders changed. And it's such a small, out-of-the-way place with a disproportionate number of famous people who originated from there. So it's I think today it's called Sigheto Marmate, but the Jews always call it Sighet. It was at one point called Marmaros Sighet, and it was a very, very strong center of first Orthodox Jewish life, and then later on Hasidic Jewish life that came later, and from the late 18th century. So there were Jews living in the area of Transylvania back in the 16th century, but in Sighet there were no Jews living there until the mid-1700s, believe it or not. It's one of the newest Jewish communities in the entire world. There were Jews living in New York for more than 100 years before the first Jews settled in Sighet. So I always find that ironic that, Sighet is a throwback to the Altaheim when Jews were living actually in New York. The New York Jewish community was well established for more than a century before the first Jews ever settled in Sighet. In 1728, the census found that there were 4 Jews living in Sighet. In the 1740s, the first minyan was started. There were 10 families by 1746. In 1787, there was 142 Jews. And then following the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century, so then there's a migration south from Galicia, and there's more Jews living there in the late 17, early 1800s. The first shul is built in Sighet in 1807. So again, if we would compare that to the United States, there were literally tens of shuls built in New York and Philadelphia and in other places, in Charleston and in many other places in America by 1807. And here the first shul in Sighet's history is built in 1807. That's 130 years before the war. So it's a very, very new community. In 1828, there's 46 Jewish families, which was about 10% of the population. And then it starts to boom in the second half of the 19th century. By 1891, there were 5,000 Jews living there. That's already a very, very it's a large Jewish population. That's not even like a little shtetl anymore. So in the second half of the 1800s is when there's this big boom, a lot of migration, it rises in prominence. They're about a third of the city population. In 1910, there was nearly 8,000 Jews living there, which is 34% of the population. And in 1930, there was almost 11,000 Jews living there. So it was a very, very large city, especially for Romania. It's probably one of the largest Jewish communities in the area. And in 1941, they are, again, over 10,000 Jews living there, and they are 39%. It's almost 40% of the population. That means, nearing half of the city's population. And Sighet had the highest proportion of Jews of any Hungarian town. And incredibly enough, even at this late stage in the 1930s, most of them were still Orthodox. So, which is fascinating, because despite the move towards secularization across the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including in Transylvania, Sighet itself remained a mostly Orthodox community. Even after the whole Teilung and the split with the Neolog in the 1870s, it remained a very strong Orthodox community. So that's a big testament to the strength of tradition in Sighet's history. There were some very prominent families in the Sighet Jewish community through generations, and they were leaders in the community, and they, as families, even though they were wealthy, upstanding families, which very often they were the first ones to secularize, in Sighet's case they actually stayed Orthodox, and that it might have had a very positive impact on the rest of the community, that it maintained that it remained somewhat traditional, that it made the Kahanas, the Freunds, and other leading wealthy families remained Orthodox despite their wealth and social standing, which was rather unique. And then that's in the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the Great War, until World War I, and after the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed at the end of the war, at the end of World War I. So there's this division of Eastern Europe, and the Treaty of Trianon, I've always read it, I've never pronounced it, I don't think ever, divided Transylvania in half. The area south of the Tisza River, which included Sighet, became part of Romania, and the area north became part of Czechoslovakia. So half of Transylvania ends up in Romania. And the Romanian government was quite anti-Semitic, and there was growing anti-Semitism, and it was an oppressive atmosphere. And then in 1941, the Romanian government deported a lot of Jews who were not Romanian citizens who had fled from Hungary, and by then it was Hungary. I'm sorry. By 1941, it was Hungary again. So many non-citizens, many Polish citizens or people who weren't Hungarian or Romanian, I guess, citizens were deported. Many of them were deported from Sighet to Kamenets-Podolsky, where they were killed by the Nazis and their collaborators in the summer of 1941. So Hungary gets it from Romania in 1940, and with the Nazi invasion of Hungary in March 1944. So now the Sighet's Jews fall under Nazi occupation, which they had been relatively safe. They're under the anti-Semitic Hungarian government from 1940 to 1944, but now they're under direct Nazi occupation. And like the rest of the Jews from the area, they're ordered into a ghetto in April. And then and there's two separate ghettos really in Sighet, and there were neighborhoods of the city which had originally been poorer neighborhoods of Sighet, and the ghetto was very crowded. There was about 20 people in every room, and the Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators rounded up the Jews of the small rural communities in the area of Sighet, and they stuffed them into the Sighet ghetto. So the population of the ghetto ended up being close to 13,000 Jews, and then the ghetto was liquidated, and the Jews were deported to Auschwitz in 4 transports between May 16th and May 22nd, 1944, where almost the entire Jewish community, storied and important historic Jewish community of Sighet, almost all of them were wiped out and killed in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. After the war, there were survivors who returned to Sighet, and Jews in general from Maramaros gravitated to Sighet. They came to the larger towns where there was still a community, so that by 1947, incredibly enough, there were well over 2,000 Jews living in Sighet once again, and they reestablished the community. They reopened the shul. It wasn't just survivors from Sighet, but a considerable numbers of Jews who settled from there from other parts of Romania, where it was back in Romania after the war. So the community was reestablished, but because of communism and immigration and all that, so the community dwindled over time, and by the 1970s it was, I think, only a couple of hundred Jewish residents, and then by the 1990s it was even less, and today maybe there's just a couple of Jews left in Sighet. But if we go back to the 18th century, when there's just a couple of Jews living there, it was a relatively small Jewish population, and this is the 18th century. The 1700s is the post-Sabbatian era. It seems that some of those few Jews who were living in Sighet were actually followers of Shabtai Tzvi. So some of the original Jewish settlers in Sighet were Sabbatians, and even more so of the successor, the remake of Shabtai Tzvi, the Jacob Frank saga, which was a whole crazy story in Eastern Europe, and the Frankists. So Sighet Jews were, many of them, I mean, there wasn't that many of them altogether, but some of them who lived there were followers of Jacob Frank. They were Frankists. So that's an interesting origins to the community. As the community developed, they built several shuls. There are several subdivisions in different neighborhoods and different styles. There was the old shul, the central shul. Later on, there was what they call the Sfard shul, or the Vishnitzer Klois, which still exists. It's I think it's still in operation for whatever Jews are there or whoever visits. I think it's still actually a shul. I think partially it's also a museum. There were several other shtibels as well, and almost all of them were basically built in either the late 19th or early 20th centuries. For example, if we focus on the Vishnitzer Klois, it was built, the building that still exists, a beautiful, prominent building, it was built in 1902, but the community that davened in the Vishnitzer Klois was established a few decades earlier. The rabbis of the town were already the Teitelbaums by now, members of the Teitelbaum dynasty, and they were the mainstream community, obviously. They were, in Hungary, there was the Orthodox and the Neologues. Obviously, Teitelbaums were part of the Orthodox community, which was understandable. But the Kahana family, which was a prominent family, which I'm going to get to, hopefully, and either now or in a part 2 where you're going to have, Sighet is such a big story, we're going to have at least 2 parts, and if we need to, we'll have 3 as well. So the Kahanas, the Kahana family, who are an old, prominent, wealthy, rabbinic family in Sighet, as well as the Vishnitz Hasidim, and a student of the Chassam Sofer who is related to the Kahana family, Rav Yehuda Modrin, who they all separated from the mainstream Teitelbaum-controlled mainstream Orthodox community, and they separated from them, and they established what they call the Sfard Kehila, or the status quo, in the lingo of Hungarian Orthodoxy at the time, or Hungarian Jewish communities at the time. And they later on, this community, decades later, appointed the religious Zionist Rabbi Dr. Shmuel Binyamin Danzig as their rabbi. And it was considered a bit more of a progressive community than the mainstream one in Sighet. And this shul, this Vishnitzer Klois, was one of the main shuls right up to the war. A beautiful building. Officially, it's still in use as a shul today, although there's not much of a community remaining there. So that's just a story of one building, which is really a story of several chapters of history of Sighet Jewish life, which I'm going to delve into as we go along. There were several Hasidic dynasties that had a strong presence, and sometimes even the Rebbes living there in Sighet. Obviously, the Sighet Hasidic dynasty, which was the Teitelbaums, they were the main one. But there was also Spinka Hasidim and Rebbes living there. Vishnitz was probably, for quite some time, the largest and most prominent Hasidic community in Sighet. Krechnev, which is an Advarna branch, and others. From the mid-19th century until its destruction in the Holocaust, which is the last century basically before the war, Sighet had a healthy growing population, which I spoke about earlier. And this led to a diverse community, a bit different than we'd imagine, because Sighet is so much associated with the Teitelbaum dynasty, which is somewhat the extreme faction of Hungarian Orthodoxy, so we would assume that there was not much diversity in Sighet. But actually there was, and from the early 1900s, Sighet was considered a more modern and progressive community. Some of its Jewish residents were completely secular. And even most of the religious members of Sighet, Jews in Sighet, were somewhat more modern and progressive. There was the old Ashkenaz non-Hasidic community, which was led by the Kahana family, descendants of the Kuntres Hasfeikos, Rav Yehuda Kahana-Heller, who I'm going to get to. Like I said, they had a separate community for a time. There was a religious Zionist community, which was officially Hasidic, but not really. They were kind of associated. They were associated with the Vishnitzer Klois. They were loosely associated with Vishnitz. There were several other Hasidic communities which I mentioned before. There was of course, the main one was the Sighet Hasidic community, the Teitelbaums, and also they were also the rabbis of the town. Now, with its destruction, in the Holocaust, so it's important to frame that in context also. Like I mentioned before, it was not very unique. It was very typical of the towns of Transylvania, which were all part of Romania until 1940. The Vienna Awards moves it to Hungary in 1940, and anti-Semitism increases. There's the drafting of males into the labor brigades, but besides for that, life does continue as normal otherwise. Throughout the Holocaust, throughout the war, these Jewish communities in Hungary are almost continuing business as usual, besides for anti-Semitic legislation and drafting of adult males into labor brigades, and that all changes with the Nazi invasion of Hungary in March 1944. And Sighet, like most Jewish communities in Transylvania and Eastern Hungary, they have Pesach at home, and that's the last holiday at home, and then a few weeks in a ghetto, and then the deportation to Auschwitz around Shavuos time, and almost all are killed. But what's unique about Sighet is that the community reemerges after the war, like I said. But it dwindled in communist Romania after the war. So now I want to get more into some of the very prominent individuals who were so much part of Sighet's history, and the most prominent one in the early days was the Kahana family. Rav Yehuda Kahana-Heller, known as the Kuntres Hasfeikos, after the very important sefer that he wrote, born in 1743 and lived till 1819. He was the oldest brother of his more famous brother, who was his younger brother, Reb Aryeh Leib Heller, who was the decisive. So the Kuntres Hasfeikos is the older brother, and they came from an important rabbinic family in Galicia, Poland. And the Kuntres Hasfeikos, Rav Yehuda Kahana-Heller, worked in business, and then he taught in a cheder, and he was friends with Rabbi Yosef Ta'imim, the Pri Megadim, and later corresponded with him. Later on, he lived in Lvov, which is Lemberg, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a time. He assisted his younger brother, the Ktsais, in publishing the Ktsais, in publishing his magnum opus, the Ktsais HaChayshin. In the meantime, he had worked on his own unique commentary to the Shach's Sefer, the Shach, the Reb Shapsi Kohen, earlier, who lived 150 years before that. The Shach had a Sefer Tukfa Kohen, and he wrote a commentary on it regarding the halachas of Sfeikos. This Reb Yehuda Kahana-Heller, which he intended to publish together with the Shach's aforementioned work, and he titled it Kuntres Hasfeikos, and he ended up publishing it as an addendum to his brother's sefer, the Ktsais HaChayshin, and subsequently it has been published on its own as well by his descendants and later on. And that's how he's remembered in the yeshiva world, which continues to study his sefer and revere his sefer until this very day. What's not as well known is the continued trajectory of his life and career. In 1802, he was appointed by part of the Sighet community as their rabbi, after he had served in a couple of other smaller rabbinical positions in other smaller towns. There was actually a dispute in Sighet in 1802 because another faction of the community preferred Reb Menachem Mendel Stern, and it ended up being a whole to-do, but they managed to work out a compromise in which Rav Yehuda Kahana-Heller served as the chief rabbi of the town, while Reb Menachem Mendel Stern was the Av Bezdin. And Rav Menachem Mendel Stern outlived Rabbi Yehuda Kahana-Heller, so he succeeded him upon his passing as rabbi of the town. He got both positions. And the Kuntres Hasfeikos, Rabbi Yehuda Kahana-Heller, was a popular and charismatic rabbi, leader, and was known throughout the region of Maramaros. He's historically significant because he was the first major rabbinic figure, or one of the first major rabbinic figure in this recently settled district. There weren't, like I said, there weren't that many Jews who ever lived here. It was a relatively newly settled area, and here, this very prominent individual, he kind of like put it on the map. He's the first major rabbinical figure who not just settled in Sighet, but in the whole Maramaros area. It's also worth noting that he was Ashkenaz. He was non-Hasidic. So the established custom in Sighet, as well as most of the communities in the Maramaros area, were initially Ashkenaz non-Hasidic even before the Hasidim settled in Unterland over the 19th century with their steady immigration from Galicia and Ukraine. So that's an important fact to consider, because we assume that Unterland was always Hasidic and Oberland was the Chassam Sofer crowd. They were the ones who were Ashkenaz non-Hasidic. But it turns out that even in areas of Unterland, especially Maramaros, were initially settled very often by these type of people, by Rav Yehuda Kahana-Heller and communities that he led, and similar people to him, that they were Ashkenaz as well. They came in the 1700s or early 1800s before the Hasidic movement spread altogether, and therefore the initial communities very often were Ashkenaz and non-Hasidic. Now, he is not just known as the author of the Kuntres Hasfeikos. He authored another work which was published by his family posthumously and has also become quite renowned and popular in the yeshiva world, and that is the Trumas Hakri, which was his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat. Now, he became the patriarch of this incredible Kahana family, and Rabbi Yehuda Kahana-Heller's descendants remained a prominent force to be reckoned with in Sighet and its environs, even down to the 20th and 21st century post-war in Israel and the United States. They served as rabbis, communal activists and leaders, and especially wealthy and powerful businessmen. Another interesting side point is that they, the Kahana family, as well as their community, whoever associated with them, remained, for the most part, some of them became Spinka Hasidim, but for the most part, they remained Ashkenaz non-Hasidim. So there's this faction in Sighet, right up to the war, that remained religious, Orthodox, and Ashkenaz non-Hasidic, which might seem surprising given the region, the whole Maramaros, Transylvania region. It would seem surprising, but it shouldn't be surprising because it was relatively common. So this Rabbi Yehuda Kahana-Heller had a huge family, and some of the prominent descendants and their roles in the Maramaros area and beyond is worth noting. A few of Rabbi Yehuda Kahana-Heller's sons were Dayanim in Sighet, and others were rabbis in the area. A grandson through marriage, married to the daughter of his son-in-law, Rabbi Shmuel Zanvil Kahana, was the one I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Yehuda Modrin, who was a fascinating personality. He grew up in Preshburg itself. He was born there. He grew up there. The Chassam Sofer was his Mayil, and then his Rebbe. He ended up studying in Preshburg Yeshiva, and he became one of the closest students of the Chassam Sofer in his later years. And at the same time, he was also close with the Yismach Moshe, the Maramaros, other great rabbis in Hungary. And Rabbi Yehuda Modrin lived in Sighet for the rest of his life. He turned down various rabbinical positions. He just stayed and studied Torah in Sighet. He had a bit of a yeshiva. One of his prominent students in this yeshiva was Reb Shlomo Yehuda Tabak, who grew up in Sighet. He was a student of the Yetiv Lev of Sighet, the first, one of the earlier members of the Teitelbaum dynasty, who we're going to get to in part 2, get to a lot. And he also was a student, Rabbi Yehuda Modrin was also a student of the Kol Aryeh in Mad, and of Rabbi Yehuda Modrin in Sighet, of course. And this Rabbi Shlomo Yehuda Tabak was one of the greatest rabbis in Hungary in the second half of the 19th century and wrote many popular works, including the Erech Shai, other Sfarim. Either way, this Rabbi Yehuda Modrin affiliated with the Hasidic community and its customs and leaders more and more over the course of his life. There are even those that claim that the Chassam Sofer was disappointed with this development, this tendency towards Hasidus and his prized Talmud, but I'm not 100% sure if that's true, because the Chassam Sofer passed away when Rav Yehuda Madrin was still quite young, and I'm not sure if this tendency was so pronounced in his younger years. It's something that I have to check into further. Either way, Rav Yehuda Madrin was also involved in the publication of his wife's grandfather's Kuntres Hasfeikos and Trumas Akri, and his comments on the Kuntres Hasfeikos are included and studied in each subsequent publication. Now, many other Kahanas resided in Sighet or all over Maramaros, wealthy, powerful. Another descendant was Tzvi Hirsch Kahana-Heller, who published and edited an Orthodox newspaper in Sighet named the Sigheter Zeitung. Another great-grandchild was Reb Chaim Aryeh Kahana, who grew up in Sighet. He was a student of the Yetiv Lev, Rabbi Kasil Yehuda Teitelbaum. He was later appointed a dayan on the Sighet Bezdin, and his son, Reb Nachman Kahana, who also grew up in Sighet, he then married the daughter of the Spinka Rebbe, and he became a rabbi in Spinka. And his descendants, this Reb Nachman Kahana's descendants, established the Kahana branch of the Spinka Hasidic dynasty. So aside from all those Kahana Spinka Rebbes, which there were quite a few of them, there were other branches of the family who became prominent and famous in post-war Israel. Some of the most famous ones who became famous in post-war Israel was Kalman Kahana, who was one of the heads of the Poyalei Agudas Yisrael, very prominent politician and thinker and leader. He was a student of the Chazon Ish. His brother, Yitzchak Cohen, was the Chief Justice of the Israel Supreme Court for a time. And one of my favorite is a contemporary. He's alive today. He's someone, a great scholar. He's one of my favorite contemporary scholars. I love reading his works. Is Professor Maoz Kahana, who I cite quite often on this podcast. He's also a descendant of the Kuntres Hasfeikos, direct descendant. He's a Kahana till today. Another important family at this time was the Freund family and its prominent mothers. It was another prominent and powerful family in the 19th and 20th century Sighet. They were Roshei Kahal. The Rosh Kahal, the head of the Jewish community in Sighet in the second half of the 19th century, was a fellow by the name of Reb Moshe Aryeh Freund. And he was known as the Sigheter Rosh Kahal for his really decades long, it was like 40, 50 years that he was the head of the community, and he was the patriarch of a rather large and prominent family in Sighet communal, religious, and political life. He also ran the Chevra Kadisha, which was quite common for the Rosh Kahal to do at the time, and his children and grandchildren served as rabbis and communal leaders all across the area. For instance, Rav Yeshua Freund was a renowned Hungarian rabbi. He also was a student of the Yetiv Lev in Sighet, also of the Divrei Chaim and Sons. He was known as a kanoi, a religious extremist, and then he served as a rabbi and Rebbe, Hasidic Rebbe, also in a few Hungarian communities. And interestingly enough, his grandson was the very respected leader of the Eidei Charedis in Yerushalayim, Rav Moshe Aryeh Freund, and he's obviously named for the patriarch of the family. So it can be said that the Freund, Kahana, and Teitelbaum families, those three big families, they dominated Jewish life in Sighet for over a century, and many of their prominent descendants continue to be in leadership positions in the Jewish world today. So Sighet has an outsized influence on the Jewish world even pre-war and also in today's post-war. So this is the end of part one of the story of the Jewish history, the Jewish community in Sighet, and I will continue with part two, which will be devoted mostly to the story of the Teitelbaum dynasty. We didn't even touch on all the Teitelbaums, all the Yetiv Lev, and even before the Yetiv Lev, and the Kedushas Yantiv, that's Chaim, the Satmarav, of course, grows up there as well, and the Beirach Moshe, and others. So part two will be mostly about the Teitelbaums, and we'll continue picking up the story in part two, which will be released shortly in a couple of days. You don't have to wait long. So stay tuned for part two of the story of Sighet and the Teitelbaums. And this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.